Camilla has just been struck by the one royal blow she never imagined King Charles would allow to land. Only 5 minutes ago, Buckingham Palace confirmed that Charles was withdrawing, William was stepping into command, and Catherine would stand at his side at the very heart of the monarchy. Yet that was not what left Camilla shaking with fury. Buried within the order was a final directive, written in Charles's own hand, that locked her household out completely. Within seconds, the news raced through London. Broadcasters rushed toward the palace gates. Phones lit up across Westminster. Senior aides slid into position before the public could even grasp what was unfolding. Inside Buckingham Palace, 2 ceremonial chairs stood waiting beneath the royal crest. One for William, one for Catherine. Nothing for Camilla. Then the doors of the throne room swung open. William stepped in first, carrying the look of a man handed authority long before he was ready to enjoy it. Catherine walked at his side in silence, composed yet plainly moved. Princess Anne stood near the front. Charles was nowhere in the procession. Camilla was nowhere at all. Every lens caught the same picture, and everyone watching understood its message before the palace uttered a single line of explanation. The future had arrived ahead of schedule. This was no ordinary handover of tasks. For months, Charles had worked to convince the nation that the monarchy was still holding firm. State papers landed on his desk each morning. Carefully staged photographs showed him at work. Palace briefings insisted his duties were carrying on. But behind those images, exhausting meetings were being canceled, long ceremonies trimmed, and William quietly slipped into appearances that had once belonged to the king. The turning point came during preparations for a major state ceremony in London. Charles arrived determined to see the rehearsal through. He never did. Witnesses reportedly watched the color drain from his face as directions continued to be read out. His replies grew shorter. His concentration slipped. After one last pause, the room was cleared and his doctors were summoned. Their verdict was blunt. The pace had to end. Charles was warned that shouldering the full weight of daily royal work risked damaging his recovery. He was told to hand over most of his responsibilities at once and brace himself for a much longer absence. That night, an emergency gathering was called at Buckingham Palace. William, Catherine, Anne, and a small circle of constitutional advisors were summoned with no explanation. Hi viewers, are you glad Charles chose William and Catherine over Camilla? Comment yes or no below. And if you feel Camilla has clung to palace influence for far too long, do not simply watch this story unfold in silence. Like this video, share it with every royal supporter you know, and subscribe right now. Every like and every share signals to YouTube that this story must be pushed forward instead of letting what happened inside the palace fade away beneath another polished statement. If William and Catherine deserve your backing, prove it before the next revelation drops. A sealed folder was waiting at the center of the table. Its title was brief, but its weight was immense. The Royal Continuity and Succession Order. William at first assumed it dealt with a handful of scrapped engagements. Catherine expected only a short-term reshuffle and stayed quiet. Charles opened the document and revealed that it moved state audiences, senior palace appointments, ceremonial planning, and the long-term course of the monarchy directly into William's hands. Then he turned toward Catherine. Under the order, she would take on duties normally reserved for the reigning queen: state banquets, diplomatic receptions, the public program of the royal household, the visible responsibilities that tell Britain, the Commonwealth, and the world who now sits at the center of royal life. Catherine did not answer at once. She knew that stepping into the role would reshape how every future appearance would be read. William pushed back. He warned Charles that the nation might believe he had pressured the transition into being. Catherine cautioned that standing beside a ceremonial throne while the king recovered could look like ambition. Charles refused to let them carry that weight. He said the choice belonged to him and that the institution could no longer be shielded by pretending his strength was unchanged. But Charles had another worry. Before the discussion could continue, Anne placed a second folder beside the first. Inside sat confidential notes drawn from members of Camilla's household. The papers reportedly explored how Camilla might safeguard her authority if Charles pulled back, how her office could still exert control over ceremonies, appointments, and the palace calendar, and how William's grip on power could be framed as merely temporary. William read the opening page twice. Catherine did not move, but the implication was impossible to overlook. While Charles fought to keep up with his duties, Camilla's household had already been quietly plotting the power that might remain in her hands. William and Catherine had never been drawn into those conversations. Charles had never sanctioned them. Anne had uncovered them before the plan could move any further. The health crisis had pushed Charles into stepping aside. The secret notes forced him to decide who would truly rule in his place. William's eyes stayed on the first page, then drifted to the second. The wording was careful. Nothing openly defied the king. Nothing so much as whispered the word power. Yet every sentence pulled in the same direction. Camilla's household had been preparing for Charles's absence before William had even been told how grave that absence might become. The notes outlined an advisory setup based at Clarence House. It would give Camilla's office the ability to review ceremonial plans, propose changes to the royal diary, and keep a foothold in state banquets and public appearances. One paragraph proposed that William's expanded authority should be described publicly as temporary, even if Charles remained away for months. That single sentence shifted the mood of the room. William asked who had drafted it. Anne turned another page and pointed toward a list of names. Senior members of Camilla's office, private secretaries, household advisors. Charles studied the names without a word. He had not approved the meeting. He had not asked for the proposal. And he had not been informed that his own wife's household was already scheming to preserve its grip after he stepped back. Catherine held her composure, but her gaze moved to the margins. Handwritten remarks had been scribbled beside the proposals. One suggested that major ceremonial decisions ought to require consultation with the Queen's office. Another warned against letting Kensington Palace become the sole seat of authority during the king's recovery. Beneath the polite language, the message was unmistakable. William could carry the load, but Camilla intended to keep her hand on the levers. Anne explained that the papers had reached her after a senior aide grew uneasy. The concern had been dressed up as continuity, stability, experience. Palace language had a way of making almost anything sound harmless. Charles shut the folder and asked whether Camilla knew of the proposal. Anne said the discussions had taken place through her household, but the papers did not reveal exactly how much she had personally endorsed. William glanced toward the door. Charles halted him. This could not become a shouting match in a corridor, not with staff crossing through Buckingham Palace and reporters watching every ripple in the royal schedule. Camilla would be called privately and given her chance to speak. The meeting broke for 20 minutes. William stepped into an adjoining room that looked out over the palace gardens. His anger had not faded. It had simply settled. Catherine followed him and reminded him that the papers were dangerous precisely because they sounded reasonable. A public accusation would allow Camilla's office to deny everything and paint William as a man impatient for the crown. He knew that made the situation worse. When Camilla entered, Charles remained seated at the head of the table. Anne kept the folder closed. William stood near the fireplace. Catherine sat opposite the chair set for Camilla. No raised voices met her. The silence carried enough weight. Charles asked whether her household had discussed an advisory council operating from Clarence House once he withdrew. Camilla paused, then said that responsible staff had explored several possibilities. She framed it as preparation, not ambition. A monarchy facing uncertainty, she argued, could not afford to cast aside experience. William did not cut in. Camilla went on. She had stood alongside Charles through years of public pressure. She understood the diplomatic calendar, the ceremonial machinery, and the personalities inside the royal household. Removing her office from every important decision, she insisted, would not build stability. It would sow disruption. Then came the request. The order should be adjusted. Camilla proposed a formal position that would let her retain a hand in state banquets, ceremonial appointments, charitable patronages, and the public program. William would handle constitutional business. Catherine could stand beside him representing the crown, but Camilla's household would remain involved wherever tradition, protocol, or the king's interests were in play. It sounded like compromise. It was not. Catherine posed a single question. Who would decide when William and Camilla disagreed? Camilla replied that Charles's wishes should guide them. Charles looked down at the unsigned order. His absence was the very reason the arrangement existed. Yet Camilla's proposal still hinged on him arbitrating disputes from private rooms while he was meant to be recovering. The burden would come flooding back through calls, competing instructions, and appeals for his intervention. Anne opened the folder and slid one page across to him. It described William's authority as reversible. That word ended the conversation. Charles told Camilla that no amendment would be made that would create a second court or dilute the heir's authority. Camilla's expression shifted. She turned toward William and asked whether this was what he wanted. William replied that he had not written the order. Charles had. Camilla left without accepting the decision. The door closed softly behind her, but no one mistook that calm for surrender. Charles then turned to the constitutional advisor with the question everyone had been avoiding. Could Camilla's household still challenge the order after it was signed? The advisor studied the final page and said there was only one way to make certain they never could. The advisor did not respond immediately. He drew the unsigned order closer, examined the closing clause, then lifted his gaze to Charles. A transfer of duties could be contested through interpretation, he explained. A household might insist on consultation rights. An aide might delay an appointment. A disputed instruction could be sent back for clarification. None of those moves would overturn William's authority, but each one could slow it, weaken it, and drag the king back into the very struggle he was trying to leave behind. Charles understood. This was no longer about whether William could bear the workload. It was about whether anyone would be allowed to block him while claiming to defend the crown. The mood in the room changed. William stepped away from the fireplace and sat down across from his father. His anger had cooled into something denser. He told Charles that he would not accept authority built upon public humiliation. He would not appear before the country as though illness had become an opportunity. If the announcement was to go ahead, it had to safeguard the king's dignity. Charles nodded. Stepping aside was not surrender, he said. It was a choice made before weakness allowed others to choose for him. Catherine asked how the transition would be framed. Her worry was clarity. The country could not be shown one picture while the palace worked to a different script. If William was expected to lead, the public program had to mirror that. If Catherine was expected to carry the Queen's visible duties, no private office could be permitted to quietly rewrite her decisions. Anne watched Charles closely. He had spent years juggling affection, duty, history, and guilt. Now every compromise circled back to the same knot. Camilla wanted acknowledgement for standing at his side. William needed unquestioned authority as heir. Catherine needed shielding from claims that she had seized something not hers. The monarchy needed one voice. Only one of those needs could shape the order. The advisors began redrafting the document. Clauses granting consultation rights to the Queen's household were struck out. State audiences would pass straight to William. Senior palace appointments would require his sign-off. Long-term planning would move under his office. Catherine would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the public program tied to the royal household. Anne would remain the bridge. Not the ruler, not the rival, the witness. For nearly an hour, Charles read every line. He asked what would happen if his recovery lasted weeks, then months, then longer than expected. The answers grew less comfortable each time. A temporary arrangement could not stay temporary forever, simply because no one wanted to name what came next. The crown could not live inside a pause. Charles reached the last page. The signature line waited beneath the royal seal. Beside it lay the fountain pen prepared by his private secretary. William expected him to sign. Catherine expected another delay. Anne noticed his hand drift away from the signature line and move instead toward the blank space beneath the final clause. He began to write slowly. No authority granted through this document may be challenged by the Queen's household. That one sentence transformed the meaning of everything that came before it. William read it once, then again. The order was no longer just a medical arrangement. It was a wall. Charles had not merely handed responsibility to his son. He had blocked the very office most likely to contest how that responsibility might be exercised. Catherine glanced toward Anne. Anne showed no surprise, but her stillness revealed that she grasped the scale of what had just happened. Charles had chosen institutional certainty over private peace, and he had done it in his own hand. That mattered. Typed language could be blamed on advisors. Legal phrasing could be brushed off as routine. A handwritten sentence from the king himself could not be dismissed as an administrative misstep. Hi, viewers. If Charles was right to stop Camilla's household from interfering, do not let this moment pass in silence. Like the video, share it with someone who supports William and Catherine, and subscribe now. When viewers stay quiet, Palace Spin wins. When thousands respond together, YouTube has no choice but to push the story further. Charles signed beneath the sentence. Anne signed as witness. William placed his hand on the document but did not lift it. For a few seconds, father and son remained on opposite sides of the table, both aware that the paper between them had shifted more than the royal diary. It had shifted the center of power. A secretary entered, sealed the copies, and asked where the first should be delivered. Charles answered without hesitation, Clarence House. Camilla received it before the announcement had even been drafted. She turned the pages, reached the handwritten line, and stopped. Then she called for her staff. The meeting at Buckingham Palace was finished. The battle over what Charles had signed was only beginning. At Clarence House, Camilla's staff braced themselves for rage. What they encountered instead was composure. She placed the copied order on a table and asked each advisor to read the handwritten sentence for themselves. No one spoke. The words were too blunt. They left no room for negotiation, no quiet path back into palace decisions, and no opening to argue that William's authority still depended on her blessing. Camilla asked whether the sentence might be softened before the announcement went public. Her legal advisor answered with care. The king had written it himself. The seal had been affixed. Anne had witnessed the signature. Any attempt to alter the wording would require Charles to reopen the order. Camilla understood the problem. Charles had shut the door before she could even reach it. Her private secretary suggested that she still appear beside him. A unified image, he argued, might preserve influence that the document had stripped away. Camilla dismissed the idea. Standing beneath palace cameras while William and Catherine were unveiled as the new heart of the monarchy would look like consent. Worse still, it would turn her into a witness to her own exclusion. She would not hand them that photograph. Across London, Buckingham Palace was moving with unusual speed. Communications officers were drafting the statement. Ceremonial staff were measuring positions in the throne room. Security teams were revising arrival routes. Government representatives in Westminster received restricted notice that the king would address the nation on the future conduct of royal duties. The wording was chosen with great care. Charles was not abdicating. William was not being crowned. Catherine was not being declared queen. Yet every practical detail pointed toward the same reality. Authority was moving. Public responsibility was moving. The visible weight of the crown was moving with them. The palace statement would call it continuity. The room would call it succession. Charles insisted on appearing first. His advisors wanted a written announcement released through official channels, but he refused to let illness speak on his behalf. He would face the cameras himself, explain the decision, and make it clear that William had not demanded it. That mattered to him more than anyone realized. William had spent years preparing to inherit the crown, but preparation was not the same as desire. Charles knew how quickly the public could twist duty into ambition. One photograph of William too near the throne, one poorly chosen phrase, one hint that Catherine looked too comfortable, and the transition could be recast as a family takeover. So Charles would carry the blame himself. He approved a short address stating that his recovery required a reduction of duties. He would confirm that William was taking over state audiences, senior appointments, and strategic planning. He would name Catherine as the one overseeing major ceremonial functions and the household's public program. Then he added a line the advisors had never prepared. The future must not wait for pride to admit what duty already knows. No one asked him to strike it out. At Clarence House, Camilla received the final schedule. Her arrival time had been left blank. A place remained available near Charles during the opening statement, but no role had been assigned to her beyond it. She could attend as his wife. She could not participate as a decision-maker. That distinction cut deeper than any public insult ever could. Camilla sent one last message to Buckingham Palace. She asked whether Charles would reconsider the restriction on her household if she agreed to appear beside him. The reply came 20 minutes later. The order stood as signed. Camilla canceled her car. Outside Buckingham Palace, broadcasters began live coverage. Crowds gathered beyond the gates. Newsrooms across the United Kingdom cleared their schedules. The first pictures showed senior officials slipping in through a side entrance, followed by Anne, then William, and Catherine. Camilla was nowhere in sight. Rumors spread immediately. Some claimed illness. Others hinted at a private disagreement. Palace officials repeated the same phrase, a family matter. Inside, Charles waited in a private room with the original order beside him. William arrived first. Catherine followed. Anne stood by the window, watching the courtyard below fill with cameras. Charles looked tired, but his voice was steady. He told William that the announcement would reshape the public understanding of their relationship. From that moment forward, every decision would be scrutinized for signs of conflict. Every absence would be turned into a theory. Every appearance would be read as a declaration. William replied that he would honor the reign already underway. Catherine said nothing. Her eyes were on the two ceremonial chairs beyond the open doors. One marked William's place, the other marked hers. A palace aide entered and confirmed that Camilla would not be attending. Charles closed his eyes briefly, then gave the order to begin. The cameras went live, the palace doors opened, and before Charles spoke a single word, Britain saw who had chosen to stand alongside the future, and who had chosen to stay away. Charles walked into the prepared room alone. For several seconds, he stood behind the lectern without saying anything. The cameras had already found the strain around his eyes. No palace statement could disguise it. He looked resolute, but the effort it took to remain there was plain to see. Then he began. He told the country that duty sometimes required a person to recognize the difference between endurance and service. To continue at any cost, he said, would not protect the monarchy. It would expose it to uncertainty. His recovery demanded distance from the daily weight of the crown, and the institution demanded leadership that could act without hesitation. He named William. The words were measured, but their meaning rippled through London, Westminster, and every newsroom following the address. William would assume responsibility for state audiences, senior palace appointments, and the long-range direction of the royal household. The arrangement would take effect immediately. Then Charles named Catherine. She would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the public program tied to the crown. Her role would not be decorative. She would stand beside William whenever the monarchy needed to show the country who now carried its public burden. The room stayed silent. Charles did not mention Camilla. That omission struck harder than any criticism could have. He thanked those who had supported him through his treatment. He spoke of continuity, family, and the future. But the woman who had stood beside him throughout his reign was missing from both the room and the transfer of authority. At Clarence House, Camilla watched the address with 2 members of her staff. She did not speak when William's name was announced. She did not stir when Catherine's new responsibilities were listed. Only when Charles finished without naming any continuing role for her did she reach again for the copy of the order. The handwritten sentence still sat above the royal seal. Nothing had changed. Back at Buckingham Palace, Charles stepped away from the lectern. William entered through the side doors. He did not smile. He walked toward his father, bowed his head, and promised to honor the reign Charles had begun. The moment was carefully controlled. The emotion was not. Charles rested one hand briefly on William's arm, then withdrew it quickly, as though holding on any longer might expose too much. Catherine joined them a few steps later. She wore no crown, no tiara, no symbol suggesting celebration. Her expression carried the weight of the decision more than any speech ever could. Anne watched from the edge of the room. She had seen constitutional moments dressed up as pageantry before. This was different. There were no cheers inside the palace, no music, no sense of victory, only a family trying to convert a private collapse in confidence into a public image of order. Then Charles left. The cameras remained. William and Catherine turned toward the throne room, where the 2 ceremonial chairs had been arranged beneath the royal insignia. They began walking together, slowly enough for every broadcaster to capture the image. Across the United Kingdom, the symbolism was instant. This was not a coronation, but it looked like the beginning of something that could not easily be undone. William stopped before the first chair. Catherine stood beside the second. Neither sat down straight away. For one suspended moment, they remained standing, aware that the country was watching them inherit responsibility before it inherited a new monarch. Then William took his place. Catherine followed. The image spread across television screens and phones within minutes. Commentators debated whether the palace had crossed an invisible constitutional line. Supporters described it as necessary stability. Critics questioned how temporary the transfer could really be when the ceremony had clearly been designed to present William and Catherine as the monarchy's next center. One question dominated every broadcast. Where was Camilla? Palace officials kept insisting that her absence concerned a private family matter. The phrase satisfied no one. Reporters outside Buckingham Palace had already discovered that her car had been canceled before the address. Others had learned that no future ceremonial role for her appeared anywhere in the public briefing. The explanation began to unravel. Inside Clarence House, Camilla ordered the television switched off. She had expected Charles to trim his schedule. She had not expected him to make William's authority visible before the entire world. She certainly had not expected Catherine to assume duties that Camilla believed should have stayed tied to her own position. Her title had not been taken. Her influence had. After the cameras departed, a private secretary handed William the signed order rather than the public copy. He examined the final page and noticed something he had missed during the meeting. Charles had placed the handwritten restriction directly above the royal seal. Anyone attempting to challenge William would have to pass that sentence before reaching the king's signature. It was not an afterthought. It was the whole point. William carried the original order into a smaller audience room after the cameras had gone. The noise outside Buckingham Palace continued, but inside, the building felt drained of ceremony. Charles was waiting near the window. Catherine stood beside a table covered with briefing papers. Anne remained by the door, holding the second sealed folder no one had yet discussed. William placed the order in front of his father. He asked one question. Was the handwritten restriction truly necessary? Charles did not answer immediately. He looked at the sentence above the seal, the single line that had transformed a medical arrangement into a boundary. Then he admitted what the public statement had left unspoken. His doctors had forced him to reduce the workload. Camilla's private preparations had forced him to draw a line where authority ended. Without that sentence, every decision could have turned into a negotiation. An appointment made by William could have been questioned at Clarence House. A state banquet planned by Catherine could have been revised through private messages. A ceremonial invitation could have been delayed until Charles intervened. The king would have stepped away in public while continuing to settle disputes in private. That was not recovery. That was another form of captivity. Charles told William that he had spent too many years believing personal loyalty could be balanced against institutional clarity. This time, there could be no blurred line, no rival office, no second court operating through friendship, access, or habit. William listened without interrupting. The anger he had carried earlier began to shift. His father had not written the restriction to embarrass Camilla. He had written it because he knew how quickly uncertainty could become control. Catherine understood the cost more quietly. Charles had protected their authority, but in doing so, he had exposed the fracture inside his own household. The public would see a careful transition. The family would remember the argument behind it. Anne finally moved away from the door. She said the sentence would be studied for years because it captured the moment Charles stopped trying to please everyone. As king, he had chosen one line of command. As a husband, he had accepted the consequence. At Clarence House, Camilla was reaching the same conclusion. Her title remained, her staff remained, her rooms, engagements, and private charities remained. Yet the machinery that had given those things influence had shifted away from her. Decisions would now flow out of William's office. Ceremonial instructions would carry Catherine's approval. Appeals to Charles would no longer reopen matters that had been settled. Camilla had not lost everything. She had lost the part that mattered most, the ability to shape what came next. By evening, the image of William and Catherine beneath the royal insignia had traveled across Britain. Supporters called it stability. Critics called it a soft transfer. Palace officials rejected both descriptions. They repeated that Charles remained king and that the arrangement was designed to protect continuity. But symbols speak when statements refuse to. 2 chairs had been prepared. 2 names had been announced. 1 household had been shut out. Charles asked William for one final promise. The transition must not become a campaign against Camilla. No public retaliation. No deliberate humiliation. No attempt to erase her from his reign. William agreed, but the promise carried a limit. Respect would not mean surrendering authority. Catherine backed that line. Camilla would be treated with dignity, but she would not be allowed to reopen decisions through private pressure. That was the settlement. Cold, clear, final. Hi viewers, if William and Catherine were right to take on this responsibility, comment ready below. Then like, share, and subscribe. Because viewers who support this change cannot expect YouTube to push the story while they simply watch in silence. Every share places this moment before another royal watcher. Every subscription makes it harder for the most important palace decisions to slip away behind carefully chosen words. Anne then placed the second sealed folder on the table. Charles looked at it and asked whether it could wait. Anne said it could not. The cover carried a short title, Queen's Household, Privileges, and Residences After the Transition. Inside were instructions concerning staff access, ceremonial invitations, and the royal properties Camilla could continue using while Charles remained away from public life. One page dealt with Clarence House, another dealt with Buckingham Palace, but the final page carried a handwritten note beside Camilla's name. It marked the exact date her unrestricted palace access could end, and it had been approved before the throne room announcement had even begun. Camilla had not seen it. William had not seen it. And when Anne opened that final page, even Charles appeared unprepared for what had already been authorized. The decision carried a deadline measured not in years, but in days. That document and the single residence Camilla could be ordered to leave first is where the next story begins.